They call it the backyard. For over 2 centuries, the United States has looked south at Latin America and seen nothing but a playground for its ambitions, a resource depot for its industries, and a submissive buffer for its security. But today, if you listen closely to the winds blowing from the Amazon to the Caribbean, you will hear the cracking sound of that old colonial architecture. The backyard is burning, and the landlord is holding a bucket of gasoline. We are witnessing a moment of profound geopolitical irony, a sequence of events that historians will one day mark as the definitive stumble of the American empire. We are looking at the Venezuela Trap. The breaking news coming out of Brasilia today is not just a diplomatic statement, it is a siren blaring in an empty theater. Celso Amorim, the chief foreign policy advisor to President Lula da Silva, has issued a warning that is as chilling as it is accurate. He warned Washington that a military invasion of Venezuela would not be a quick surgical strike or a triumphant regime change operation. He explicitly used the words Vietnam-style conflict. Let that sink in. The largest power in South America is telling the self-proclaimed master of the Western Hemisphere that it is walking blindfolded into a quagmire that will consume the region in fire and blood. This is not the bluster of an enemy. This is the terrified whisper of a neighbor watching a madman light a match in a room full of dynamite. But why now? Why has the drumbeat of war reached a fever pitch at this specific moment in 2025? It is because the United States is terrifyingly predictable in its decline. When an empire loses its economic leverage, when its sanctions fail to crush the spirit of a target nation, and when its diplomatic threats are laughed at in the halls of the global South, it resorts to the only tool it has left, the hammer. The rumors of Operation Southern Spear, the closure of airspace, the movement of naval assets to the Caribbean, these are not signs of strength. They are the spasms of a hegemon that has run out of ideas. They are trying to solve a complex 21st century geopolitical problem with a 20th century gunboat diplomacy mindset. To understand this trap, you have to look past the headlines and into the deep rot of history. The United States is operating under the ghostly influence of the Monroe Doctrine, that arrogant 1,823 decree that claimed the entire Western Hemisphere as the exclusive property of Washington. For decades, they enforced this with impunity. We remember the CIA-backed coup in Guatemala in 1954. We remember the Bay of Pigs. We remember the horrors inflicted on Chile in 1973, where democracy was murdered to install a puppet loyal to American capital. They think Venezuela is just another chapter in this book. They think they can simply decapitate the leadership in Caracas, install a compliant interim government, and turn the oil spigots back on for the West. But this is the fatal miscalculation. This is not 1,973. The world has changed, but the men in the Situation Room are reading from a script that expired 50 years ago. Venezuela has spent 2 decades preparing for exactly this scenario. They have studied the American way of war. They have seen what happened to Iraq. They have seen the rubble of Libya. They have built a decentralized, asymmetric defense capability that relies not on tank battles, but on prolonged, grinding guerrilla resistance. And more importantly, they are not alone. The historical context here is crucial. Never before in the history of the Monroe Doctrine has a Latin American target been so integrated into the alternative global order. Brazil's warning is technically about a regional war, but the subtext is much darker for Washington. Amorim is essentially saying that the days of isolated interventions are over. If the U.S. Marines land on the Venezuelan coast, they are not just fighting the Venezuelan army. They are triggering a continental explosion. The borders in this region are porous. The jungle does not respect lines on a map. A conflict here would spill into Colombia, destabilize Brazil, and send millions of refugees moving north, creating the very migration crisis the U.S. claims it wants to solve. It is a snake eating its own tail. The thesis I am putting before you today is simple but terrifying. The United States is about to step on a landmine of its own design. By threatening a military solution to the Venezuela issue, Washington is exposing the ultimate limit of its power. It is proving to the world that it can no longer lead by consensus or economic attraction, only by coercion. And when that coercion meets the hard reality of South American geography and the new resolve of the global South, the result will not be a restoration of American hegemony. It will be the acceleration of its collapse. We are watching a gambler putting his last chips on a losing hand, convinced that because he won in the past, he is destined to win again. But the house rules have changed. The dealer is no longer American, and the other players at the table are armed. That table is crowded because the primary weapon of the United States, the economic siege, has jammed. To understand the panic in Washington that is driving this drift toward war, we must look at the spectacular failure of the maximum pressure campaign. For years, the architects of American foreign policy believed they had found the ultimate bloodless method of conquest, weaponized finance. They believed that by cutting Venezuela off from the SWIFT system, by freezing their gold in the Bank of England, and by criminalizing the purchase of their oil, they could induce a collapse so total that the government would simply evaporate. It was the arrogance of the Treasury Department, convinced that the US dollar was not just a currency, but the oxygen of the global economy, and that they had the power to suffocate anyone who refused to breathe the American way. But look at the reality on the ground today. The Venezuelan state did not evaporate. The government did not fall. Instead, something far more dangerous for American hegemony occurred. Venezuela adapted. The economy, though battered and bruised, began to stabilize and then mutate into something the West could no longer control. This is the phenomenon of system failure writ large. The sanctions did not isolate Venezuela. They isolated the United States from Venezuela's resources while pushing Caracas directly into the arms of the rising multipolar powers. By trying to starve the beast, Washington simply taught it how to hunt in a new forest. The blockade became a forcing mechanism for the very thing the U.S. fears most: the creation of a parallel sanctions-proof economy right in the Western Hemisphere. This is where the narrative of circumvention becomes the central driver of the conflict. The U.S. establishment is not terrified because Venezuela is a dictatorship. They have happily supported dozens of brutal dictatorships when it suited their interests. They are terrified because Venezuela has successfully circumvented the dollar. We are seeing the crystallization of a new geopolitical triad in South America involving China, Russia, and Iran, operating right under the nose of the Monroe Doctrine. When Washington sanctioned Venezuelan oil, a dark fleet of tankers, ghost ships with transponders turned off, began moving millions of barrels of crude to Chinese refineries. The oil flowed, the money returned, and the U.S. Treasury was left holding a worthless piece of paper. China has stepped in not just as a buyer, but as a silent guarantor of the state's survival, providing the infrastructure and the credit lines that the IMF and World Bank refused. Russia has provided the military hardware and the technical advisors, specialists, who know exactly how to keep air defense systems operational without Western parts. Iran has bridged the technological gap, helping to repair the refineries that U.S. sanctions were meant to rust into oblivion. This triumvirate has created a safety net that has caught Venezuela before it hit the bottom. This is the great circumvention, and it exposes the hollow nature of American power in the 2020 seconds. The sanction stick is broken because the victim has found other friends. The panic in the U.S. military-industrial complex is palpable because this circumvention sets a precedent. If a nation in the U.S. backyard can survive the full weight of American financial warfare by pivoting to the global South, then the deterrent value of sanctions evaporates globally. It sends a signal to Brazil, to South Africa, to Saudi Arabia, and to India that there is life after the dollar. This is why the rhetoric has shifted so violently from economic pressure to military option. The soft power tools have failed. The diplomatic isolation has failed. Venezuela is reestablishing ties with its neighbors. And despite the political friction, the reality of trade is resuming. Furthermore, we must analyze the specific mechanism of the petro-yuan entering this equation. Reports indicate that trade between Venezuela and its Asian partners is increasingly settled in currencies other than the US dollar. This is the ultimate red line for the American empire. The hegemony of the United States is built on the petrodollar recycling system. It is the privilege of printing the world's reserve currency that allows Washington to run massive deficits and fund its trillion-dollar military machine. When a nation with the largest proven oil reserves on the planet begins to trade outside that system, it is viewed as an existential threat to the financial architecture of the West. So, the Vietnam style war that Brazil warns of is not being planned to restore democracy. It is being planned to restore the monopoly of the dollar and to smash the physical infrastructure of this alternative alliance. Washington looks at the map and sees Russian naval visits to Havana and La Guaira. They see Chinese satellite tracking stations in the interior. They see Iranian engineers in the oil belt. They realize that they have lost control of the strategic narrative. The system failure is complete. The sanctions regime, instead of forcing capitulation, acted as a catalyst for de-dollarization. Now, faced with the humiliating reality that their economic weapons are shooting blanks, the hawks in D.C. are convincing themselves that kinetic action is the only way to reassert dominance. They are preparing to break the glass and pull the emergency lever of war, terrified that if they do nothing, the Venezuela model of resistance will spread across the continent like a contagion of sovereignty. This brings us to the most grotesque aspect of this entire charade, the moral trap. Whenever the war machine gears up, it is always lubricated with the tears of crocodile concern for human rights and democracy. We are hearing the same tired script today regarding Venezuela that we heard in 2003, regarding Iraq, and in 2011 regarding Libya. The establishment media, operating as the PR wing of the Pentagon, is busy painting a picture of a humanitarian crusade. They tell us that American intervention is necessary to save the Venezuelan people from tyranny. But let us be brutally honest with ourselves. This has never been about democracy. It has never been about the ballot box. It is, and always has been, about the geology. It is about the black gold that sits beneath the Orinoco Belt. We must strip away the veneer of noble intentions and look at the naked reality of the resource curse that the United States inflicts upon the world. The U.S. refineries in the Gulf Coast were specifically engineered to process the heavy, sour crude that Venezuela possesses in abundance. When the U.S. lost access to that cheap flow due to its own political blunders, it didn't just hurt Venezuela, it hurt the bottom line of American energy giants. The push for regime change is indistinguishable from a corporate hostile takeover. They are not trying to liberate a population, they are trying to reacquire a lost asset. To believe otherwise is to ignore a century of interventionism where democratically elected leaders were toppled the moment they threatened the profit margins of United Fruit or Standard Oil. The tragedy here is not just the intent, but the inevitable outcome. The United States has a terrifying specific competence. It is the world's most efficient machine for destroying state capacity, yet it is utterly incompetent at building it. Look at the graveyard of sovereignty that American foreign policy has left in its wake over the last 20 years. We must look at Libya. This is the ghost that should haunt every decision maker in Brasilia and Washington. In 2011, under the guise of responsibility to protect, NATO smashed the Libyan state. They promised freedom. What did they deliver? They turned the most prosperous nation in Africa into an open-air slave market, a fractured hellscape ruled by competing warlords, and a breeding ground for extremism that destabilized the entire Sahel region. This is the moral trap. The United States believes that removing a head of state solves the problem. But in reality, when you decapitate a centralized government in a resource-rich nation without a viable plan for what comes next, you do not get Jeffersonian democracy. You get Hobbesian chaos. You get the fragmentation of authority. If the U.S. invades Venezuela, they will not be greeted with flowers. They will fracture the country into fiefdoms. The military units that dissolve will not go home. They will go into the jungle with their weapons. The gangs that control the barrios will not surrender. They will become local insurgencies. The oil infrastructure the U.S. covets will be sabotaged, blown up, and rendered useless by the very people they are trying to conquer. We saw this in Iraq. The removal of Saddam Hussein did not lead to a flourishing liberal society. It uncorked the bottle of sectarian violence that killed hundreds of thousands and birthed ISIS. The U.S. interventionists are intellectually incapable of learning this lesson because their arrogance blinds them to the complexity of other societies. They view nations as vending machines. You put in a coin of intervention and you get out a democracy. But the machine is broken. Every time they shake it, it falls over and crushes the people standing next to it. The moral indictment here is severe. The United States, in its pursuit of hegemony, seemingly prefers a failed state over a sovereign state that says no. They would rather see Venezuela reduced to rubble and ruled by chaos than see it succeed as an independent nation integrated into BRICS. This is a nihilistic foreign policy. It creates the very monsters it claims to fight. By destroying the institutions of order in target nations, Washington creates the vacuums that are then filled by drug cartels, terrorists, and desperate migration flows. And this leads to the ultimate irony of the intervention argument. The U.S. claims it wants to intervene to stop the migration crisis, the millions of Venezuelans heading north. But a military invasion is the single most efficient way to turn a migration stream into a tsunami. If you turn Caracas into Baghdad, you will displace millions more. You will create a humanitarian catastrophe of biblical proportions right in the Western Hemisphere. The moral trap is that by trying to force its will, the U.S. destroys the stability it claims to uphold. It reveals the empire not as a global policeman, but as an arsonist who sets fire to the house and then blames the occupants for the smoke. They are willing to burn the village to save it. But in the 21st century, the village is armed, the neighbors are watching, and the fire is going to spread. We have arrived at the precipice of the global reckoning until now. We have discussed this potential conflict as if it were a localized event, a tragic dispute between Washington and Caracas. But to view a U.S. invasion of Venezuela in isolation is to commit the ultimate geopolitical sin, ignoring the web of alliances that now defines the modern world. The United States is no longer operating in a unipolar vacuum where it can smash a small nation without consequences. If the Marines land in La Guaira, the shockwaves will not stop at the Rio Grande. They will ripple across the Atlantic to Moscow, across the Pacific to Beijing, and deep into the global south, triggering a reciprocal escalation that the Pentagon is woefully unprepared to handle. We must talk about asymmetric warfare, not just on the battlefield, but on the grand chessboard. The strategists in Washington are still thinking in terms of carrier strike groups and air superiority. They are counting tanks and planes. But their adversaries are playing a different game. Russia and China do not need to deploy 1,000 ships to the Caribbean to make the United States bleed. They understand that in the 21st century, power is economic, it is cyber, and it is systemic. Consider the Russian response. Moscow views Venezuela not just as an ally, but as a strategic forward operating base in the Western Hemisphere, a mirror image to the U.S. presence in Ukraine. If the U.S. escalates in Venezuela, Russia will not necessarily fight there. They will apply pressure elsewhere. They will tighten the screws in Eastern Europe. They will accelerate the transfer of advanced missile technology to adversaries in the Middle East. They will unleash cyber capabilities against U.S. critical infrastructure. This is the essence of horizontal escalation. By attacking Venezuela, the U.S. is effectively inviting Russia to take the gloves off in every other theater of conflict. It is a trade-off that the American public has not been asked to make. Are you willing to risk a cyber attack on your power grid or a flare-up in Europe just to install a puppet regime in Caracas? Then there is the China factor, the silent giant in the room. Beijing has invested billions in Venezuela. They have secured loans with oil. They have built infrastructure. They will not simply write off these assets as a loss, but China's retaliation will likely be economic. The kind of warfare that doesn't make loud explosions but shatters economies. Imagine a scenario where In response to a U.S. blockade of Venezuela, China begins to strategically dump U.S. treasuries or restricts the export of rare earth minerals essential for the very high tech weapons the U.S. is using. The supply chains of the U.S. military industrial complex are dangerously dependent on the very nations they are trying to intimidate. Washington is threatening war while holding a begging bowl for the components it needs to wage it. But the most immediate form of asymmetric warfare will happen on the ground in the dense urban jungles of Caracas and the sweltering forests of the interior. The Vietnam-style conflict that Celso Amorim warned about is not a metaphor. It is a tactical certainty. The Venezuelan military has spent years preparing for a war of the whole people. This is a doctrine of distributed resistance. They have distributed millions of light arms. They have integrated the Milicia Bolivariana civilian militias into the defense architecture. An invading force can destroy the barracks, bomb the palaces, and seize the airports. But then what? Then the real war begins. Every street corner becomes an ambush. Every mountain pass becomes a kill zone. We are talking about the proliferation of man-pads, man-portable air defense systems. Venezuela possesses thousands of Russian-made Eagle-S missiles. These are shoulder-fired weapons capable of bringing down helicopters and low-flying aircraft. In a U.S. invasion scenario, these weapons will not stay in government armories. They will dissolve into the population. The U.S. air superiority, the pride of the Pentagon, will be forced to operate in a saturation environment where every rooftop could hide a missile. The cost in blood and treasure will not be the cakewalk the neoconservatives promise. It will be a slow, grinding attrition that saps the political will of the American people within months. And what of the blowback at home? This is the warning that every American citizen needs to hear, the one the mainstream media refuses to broadcast. A war in Venezuela is a direct attack on your standard of living. The global oil market is a fragile psychological beast. It runs on fear. Even if Venezuelan production is currently depressed, the mere act of turning the Caribbean, a major transit route for global energy, into a war zone will send insurance premiums skyrocketing and oil prices into the stratosphere. We are looking at an inflationary bomb, just as the Western economies are struggling to stabilize after the post-pandemic inflation crisis. A war in South America would send the price of diesel, gasoline, and jet fuel soaring. This is the asymmetric tax of empire. Every dollar spent on a cruise missile to strike Venezuela will be matched by $10 taken out of the pockets of the American working class at the gas pump and the grocery store. The supply chains that move goods from South America, food, minerals, raw materials, will be disrupted. The instability will bleed northward. Furthermore, the diplomatic isolation of the United States will be total. We are already seeing the consolidation of the global South under the banner of BRICS Plus. An invasion of Venezuela would be the final nail in the coffin of the Organization of American States, OAS. Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, the heavyweights of Latin America will not support this. They will actively oppose it. We will see the formation of a diplomatic blockade against Washington. The U.S. will find itself an island in its own hemisphere, surrounded by neighbors who view it not as a partner, but as an unpredictable, dangerous aggressor. This is the definition of a geopolitical reckoning. The United States is walking into a trap where military victory is physically impossible, because the enemy is everywhere, in the jungle, in the financial markets, in the cyber domain, and in the diplomatic halls of the world. They are fighting a 20th century colonial war in a 21st century multipolar reality. They are trying to use a hammer to fix a computer, and the result will not be the repair of the system. It will be the shattering of the screen. The global South is watching. They are taking notes. They are seeing that the emperor has no clothes, only aircraft carriers. And they know that aircraft carriers cannot stop an idea whose time has come. The idea is sovereignty. The idea is that the resources of a nation belong to its people, not to the shareholders of foreign corporations. By attacking Venezuela, the U.S. is not killing this idea, it is watering it with blood, ensuring that it grows stronger, deeper, and more resilient across the entire continent. The moment historians often refer to as the twilight of empire. the warning from Brazil, the panic in Washington, the mobilization of the global south, all of these are merely symptoms of a much deeper malady. We are witnessing the agonizing death of the myth of American exceptionalism. For 70 years, the United States has operated under the delusion that it stands outside of history, that the laws of gravity, economic, military, and moral do not apply to it. They believed they could print infinite money without inflation, sanction the world without blowback, and invade sovereign nations without defeat. But the Venezuela trap is the cold, hard wall of reality that this delusion has finally crashed into. The United States now faces a binary choice, a fork in the road that will determine the trajectory of the 21st century. On one hand, there is the path of adaptation and realism. This path requires a quality that has been entirely absent from Washington for generations: humility. It would require the U.S. to accept that the unipolar moment is over. It would mean acknowledging that the Monroe Doctrine is a relic of a colonial past, not a law of nature. It would involve lifting the sanctions, normalizing relations with Caracas, and competing for influence through trade and diplomacy rather than coercion. It would mean accepting that Venezuela has the sovereign right to sell its oil to China, to buy weapons from Russia, and to chart its own course. If the U.S. chose this path, it could remain a great power among equals, a respected partner in the Western Hemisphere. But empires rarely choose to retire gracefully. They almost always choose the second path, the path of illusion and ruin. This is the path of doubling down. It is a belief that if you just hit the problem harder, if you just drop more bombs, if you just tighten the sanctions one more turn, reality will bend to your will. This is the trap. By refusing to accept a multipolar world, the United States is accelerating its arrival. Every threat issued against Venezuela drives the global south closer together. Every sanction imposed on a developing nation convinces 10 others to abandon the dollar. By clinging to the fantasy of total control, Washington is losing the very real influence it once had. We are approaching what historians call a Suez moment. In 1956, the British Empire, deluded by memories of its past glory, tried to seize the Suez Canal by force. They thought they were still the masters of the world. But the markets crashed, the world turned against them, and they were forced to retreat in humiliation, revealing to everyone that the empire was dead. A botched invasion of Venezuela would be the American Suez. It would expose the military as overstretched, the treasury as bankrupt, and the diplomatic corps as isolated. It would not be a show of strength. It would be a definitive proof of weakness. The tragedy is that the American people are being sleepwalked into this disaster by a ruling class that faces no consequences for its failures. The architects of this war will not be the ones wading through the swamps of the Orinoco. They will be safe in their think tanks and television studios, explaining why the next surge will surely work. But the world has moved on. The global south is rising, not out of hatred for America, but out of a necessity to survive. They are building a world where one nation cannot dictate the fate of all. The Venezuela trap is simply the first major test of this new order. If Washington walks into it, it will not just be fighting a war against Venezuela, it will be fighting a war against the tide of history itself. And history has a perfect, undefeated record. The sun is setting on the ear of the hegemon. The shadows are getting long in the backyard. The question is no longer if the empire will fall, but how much of the world it will try to drag down with it in its final, desperate thrashing. This channel exists to cut through the propaganda and analyze the raw mechanics of power in this changing world. If you value geopolitical realism over mainstream narratives, you know what to do. Subscribe to the channel, like this video to help us break the algorithm, and share this analysis with those who are ready to wake up. I want to hear your insights in the comments below. Answer me this. First, do you believe the U.S. military is capable of sustaining a long-term guerrilla war in South America while simultaneously trying to contain Russia in Europe and China in the Pacific? Second, is the Monroe Doctrine finally dead, Or will Washington burn the entire Western Hemisphere to the ground trying to save it?